Hello and welcome everyone to this seminar on lessons from Kenya's fraught electronic visa policy. I am Ottilia Maunganidze, the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies. Today, we are honored to co-host this seminar with the African Migration and Development Policy Center, AMADPOC, out of Nairobi, and the Kenya Institute for Migration Studies. As you connect, please do mute your microphones as well as switching off your videos. When we get to the Q&A section, you will have the opportunity, once the floor is given to you, to switch on your microphones. This event is a public event, which means that Chatham House rule does not apply. In January of 2024, Kenya introduced an electronic travel authorization process which replaced the visa on arrival for most people with a digital pre-approval system. Although the system was intended to streamline travel, limit bureaucratic hurdles, instead the system created more bureaucratic hurdles for the majority of travelers, some of whom previously did not need a visa or prior authorization. Kenya has now started a process of exempting most African nationals from getting these electronic travel authorization, but concerns still remain as the rollout is underway. We have an esteemed panel today of migration experts that will be leading the discussions on the lessons from Kenya's fraught electronic visa policy. We will examine the policy's impact on tourism, trade, and regional integration within Africa's broader free movement agenda. Our speakers today are Professor Linda Oucho, the Executive Director of AMADPOC, our co-host for this seminar, who's an established migration expert and an independent and leading AMADPOC, which is an independent research think tank that is leading in policy-based research on migration and development issues. Professor Oucho today is joining us from Toronto, where she is the visiting Scholar of Excellence for the Canada Excellence Research Chair at the University of Toronto Metropolitan University. Prof. Oucho, we're extremely honored that you can join us. Following the introductions, if you allow me, I will refer to you as Linda, a good friend, a colleague working on a range of issues related to migration. After Linda, we will hear from Professor Michael Owiso, who is the director of the Odera Akango campus and the dean in the School of Development and Strategic Studies at Maseno University in Kenya. He is also a senior visiting research fellow at King's College in London. After Prof. Michael, we will hear from Dr. Nancy Adossi, a Togolese expert who's worked on migration, labor, mobility, and economic development in her decade-long international career that spans North America, the Middle East, and Africa. Dr. Adossi recently served as the senior coordinator of the Free Movement of Persons Protocol under the Humanitarian Affairs Division at the African Union Commission, where she led the development and implementation of the African Union Commission's Free Movement Protocol work plan. So I cannot think of a better group of people to be leading this discussion for us. So I'll turn first to you, Linda, in terms of your reflections. This is a little over a year on since Kenya introduced what they hoped would be an easier, more streamlined way of ensuring that people who enter into Kenya are properly documented without, in the words of the government at the time, the hassles of a visa process. But as we know, this has not been without challenges. So your thoughts and reflections.
Thanks, Ottilia, for having me. And it's great to have this conversation a year on. It is something that at least we've been following from our side to find out whether the ETA is actually beneficial for the country. And the way it was floated is that for security and border management purposes, it was useful to pre-screen the migrants coming into Kenya, whether they're tourists or they're people who are transitioning, moving to the country. 1 year on, it's been interesting seeing the shift because from conversations I've had with other people who've tried to access Kenya through the ETA, especially Africans, they still find the process very tedious, which is something that they never used to go through before. They felt the visa on arrival was more friendly and more accessible, making the country easy to access, knowing that you can arrive in the country and get the visa. And still, they feel that it's a tedious process to go through the ETA, even if they have been informed that it is for pre-screening purposes. On the other side of the coin, we do have people coming from other continents who say that the ETA actually has made the process easier for them to access the country because they can do things from the comfort of their desks. And it's a question of ease of access in terms of those who are crossing within the continent, across our borders, those who have access to their online platform to apply for the ETA, especially cross-border traders and tourists coming from within the region and beyond who are using road and ground transport. Those are the ones that I would want to see what has been the impact. And I've been trying to kind of find some data to find out whether it's been easier for traders to access the country, and especially those women who cross regularly between the countries to trade or to buy goods to trade back in their country. And maybe it's just me not being able to find the right resource, but I can't find any evidence that shows that the numbers have increased in terms of crossing the border. The revenue has increased in terms of what they're buying and trading in their country. So it's something that I have more questions as a researcher to want to interrogate how the ETA actually has been beneficial for trade, for within Africa, that's for one, and also for tourism for Africans who are coming from other parts of the world, especially those that had the visa-free access, or we had negotiated visa-free access for them prior to the ETA, but also an aspect of what are the perceptions on regional integration or continental integration when it comes to accessing the country. So I think that right now we're still at a volatile stage where if you look at the evidence, they would say tourism has increased by, I think it was 2.5 million that they said more recently, as in February 2025, and revenue has increased. But why did Kenya then drop 17 places in the Visa Openness Index in December? So it raises questions as to whether the ETA is actually beneficial to the country, and in what way is it beneficial aside from the economic. Maybe I'll stop there and we can have a conversation further on that. Over to you, Ottilia.
Thank you very much, Linda. A number of points that you made, and I'm going to raise these questions now and come back to them after both Prof. Michael and Nancy have spoken. Issue one is how, for particularly African travelers, I think, for example, of COMESA passport holders that previously did not need any prior authorization and could just arrive in Kenya, how this process has in some ways impacted travel plans. So the ability to just decide I'm traveling to Kenya taken away. And then the second, and I know or hope Nancy will also speak to this, the second is informal cross-border trade or informal cross-border movement that we see quite a lot in East Africa, and that has been a key contributor also to stimulating trade, stimulating development. Now, whether or not that cohort of people has not been impacted by having to add a process previously not necessary for them, recognizing that a number of them would be coming from immediate neighbors in the EAC who do not require a visa or have not required a visa to enter into Kenya for some time. So those are the two issues that will park for the next round of interventions coming forward, but to assist you in preparing also. I turn now to Prof. Michael. Prof. Michael, we had the honor of meeting just under a month ago in Mombasa, where we were having discussions convened by the UN Economic Commission for Africa and the AU Commission around three countries, Kenya, Ghana, and Zambia, around their engagement or interest in the free movement protocol, and what would be needed specific around labor mobility and skills portability. Now we're honing in on one of those countries, so we're focusing on Kenya here and looking at some lessons learned. So to you, I'll be interested in your reflections generally on Kenya's ETA in line with Prof. Linda's input, but I would also be interested to hear from you a bit more in terms of lessons that other countries can learn around implementing an approach that after a year may need to be reversed or adjusted to fit the context and the needs. Over to you, Prof. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Ottilia, and for inviting me to this session. You point out to the meeting we recently attended in Mombasa, and I want to bring in some anecdotal experiences that the participants in that meeting shared with us. One is that they lamented over the delay. Yes, it is electronic, but there are a lot of delays, there are a lot of inconveniences in the system itself. So that makes it pretty difficult for those wanting to travel into Kenya from other parts of Africa. So already there's a pointer to a system that probably is not working that well even 1 year after. One of the pointers also was that, you know, for a long time, Kenya has been an easy destination for regional meetings because of the free visa opportunity. But now, you know, many organizations, regional organizations, are beginning to rethink that because it was easier to identify Kenya as a venue because of the ease of movement earlier. So now there's a rethink around that. But more importantly, probably, is that when you look at matters tourism and trade, and I'm happy that Linda has, you know, mentioned the drop in 17 places, you know, in the openness index, and there's an indication also that trade and tourism has gone down. This indication, I can get it from the fact that the ministry, you know, under which this falls, had ordered in early 2025 a review of the system, meaning that, you know, already Kenya was already experiencing some shortfalls in terms of tourism as the largest, you know, income earner for Kenya. So that already is a pointer to the fact that Kenya is already experiencing some kind of shortfalls. We are yet to see the figures. What we have so far is anecdotal, but we are yet to see the actual figures in terms of what at the end of 2025 will be the earnings from the tourism sector and so on and so forth. So there are, you know, already pointers, as I say, to the fact that the system, because the system doesn't work very well, it's going to impact Kenya in terms of trade and tourism. In terms of regional integration, already we are talking about, you know, a system that is sort of prohibitive in terms of the ease with which people travel earlier, given the delays and so on and so forth. So it is highly likely that, you know, Kenya is not going to be a preferred destination as earlier was because of the prohibitive nature of the system until I must mention, until Kenya is able to work on the system and make it as efficient as possible. This is even worse with informal mobility, because, you know, the borders of Kenya, the countries that border Kenya, we experience a lot of informal movement along the borders. But given this, we are yet again to arrive at the figures, but definitely this is going to affect informal movement, which is a serious phenomenon along the Kenyan borders. Maybe I'll leave it there for now and wait for a discussion around this later.
Thank you very much, Prof. Michael. You've reiterated the point around informal cross-border trade in particular, but also movement. And then on tourism, which is really the mainstay in terms of external income for countries in East Africa, Kenya included. And I think these are 2 points that we would want to touch on a little bit more after Dr. Nancy has spoken. When we were in Mombasa, Dr. Nancy was one of the people as a Togolese national who shared just 2 things: the difficulty in accessing the system first and foremost, but then also reflected on the fact that in spite of notices that there would be a fee waiver, certain African nationals still had to pay for the ETA. Of course, we understand that the process is being rolled out, and the intention is that once the process is finalized, that African nationals, with the exception of those from Libya and Somalia, would be able to access without needing to pay a fee. I will add, in the spirit of anecdotes, that for me, I did not have to pay for the ETA. And once I was able to access the system, which did take some time, but once I was able to access the system, my authorization was in 3 minutes. So I would say, even though there was that element of inconvenience for me, coming from a country that does not need to pay for the fee and that has been gazetted, that process was quite easy once I was able to access the system. I think the disclaimer is once I was able to access, whereas for other nationals, they have had greater challenges in accessing the system, and then once doing so, having to pay where the information may be conflicting. But I've premised all of this, Nancy, so that you don't have to, because I think our analysis around the issues, we can make reference to some of the anecdotal evidence, but I think it's also important for us to take a step back and reflect. I mean, in the roles and capacities that you've held, really focusing more on the continental free movement protocol, in which the ideal is that all 54 member states ratify the protocol, and it facilitates freer movement on the continent, eventually allowing for right of residence as well as work, so to speak. When we almost, how do I say this, when we get out of the weeds of an individual process, I would be interested to hear from you, one, what lessons other African countries can draw from this process, but how some of these adjustments that countries are making to their visa policies align or misalign with the spirit and the intent of a continent that is freer to move. Over to you, Dr. Nancy Adossi.
Thank you, Ottilia, and thank you for the invitation to be on this esteemed panel. So I can start off with your first question, which is what lessons other African countries can learn from the implementation, at least the implementation of the right of entry phase of the protocol itself. I'd like to remind everyone that there are 3 phases. So it's right of entry, right of establishment, and right of residence. So right now, what we're seeing a lot of countries do is take the right of entry and implement that in order to sort of get a feel for what it means to have freer movement on the continent. And in terms of the right of entry, I can provide the example of Rwanda, who has been implementing the right of entry for quite a long time. And one of the things that I've had the pleasure of doing is visiting Rwanda and actually learning from them in terms of their implementation and what other countries can take away from their implementation of it. In the beginning, they did have, of course, all the concerns that all the countries have, which is security. How do we ensure we know who's coming into our country? How do we ensure that we have a way to, I should say, to organize and also to control the entry into the country, both in the air borders as well as on the ground borders, so border posts and things like that. So some of the lessons learned from those countries are of course, the one-stop border posts that are being implemented across some borders in Africa. And also in terms of air borders, we also see that there's quite a lot that's being done in terms of collection of data prior to entering the airplane. So we see a lot more countries who are implementing the right of entry looking to solutions that are viable and sustainable in terms of ensuring that they have control over who's entering their countries. And I think that another thing that I can mention is that so Africa is a continent that is characterized by movement, and whether we want to admit it or not, movement has always been part of our history. And another thing that I want to say along with movement is trade. So we've always had trade, and I think you asked that question earlier. Trade is so important to the core of Africa's culture that without trade, we wouldn't be who we are. Without trade, we wouldn't have the different families that we have, and we truly wouldn't have that culture. This free movement protocol, I've talked about it for the past year and 8 months, and I've advocated for it. But I think the most important thing about free movement is that it enables trade. So one of the things that I was actually stunned by is that AFCFTA has been going on, and free movement has also, been adopted. There are twin protocols that were adopted at the same time. AFCFTA has been running, free movement has been stalled a bit. And it's interesting to me that when you look at the data of how much trade has increased since the adoption, not necessarily the implementation, but the adoption of AFCFTA, you'll notice that it hasn't really quite grown. And one of the reasons why is because goods cannot move without people. As much of, as innovative as we are, we cannot just send cows across the border without sending someone with the cows to sell those cows. In the same way, we cannot, we haven't advanced to the point where we have self-driving trucks that are delivering goods across borders. So until we do, we need to ensure that people are able to move. And in Kenya specifically, one of the things that you can observe is that Kenya actually has a lot of cross-border trade as well. Not as much as West Africa, but it is one of the countries that has a lot of cross-border trade. And one thing I will say about Kenya is that they are implementing a lot of these policies that enable cross-border trade through the regional economic communities. So Kenya, I believe, is part of EAC as well as IGAD. And last year, Kenya was able to actually sign the IGAD Free Movement Protocol, which would then enable the cross-border trade with the other IGAD countries as well. So I think that just in terms of what countries can learn from Kenya itself is being more willing and open to implementing some of the rights of entry phases. And as slow as it can be, I think one of the things that we have to recognize in Africa is that we're not going to build the Africa that we want in one day. We can't build it in 1 year. We probably can't build it in 10 years, but we do need to keep continuously proceeding towards the ultimate goal. So I'll end here and see if there are any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You speak to something that is often said and quite abstract to a lot of people, which is political will, which is the thing that drives policy change or policy implementation, right? So within that political will, and I know we started this conversation talking about some of the hiccups, but within that political will, there's also the ability to learn, right? When Prof. Oucho was speaking earlier, he alluded to the fact that coming from the ministry responsible for tourism, really pushing to say, did we really implement the right approach when it came to the ETA? Are we yielding the benefits that were intended by this process? And then seemingly the response being, in fact, no. In fact, there might have been an incorrect assumption around what it is that grants people access. I mentioned earlier, for some people, traveling to a country for holiday is not always a 3 or 2 month planning process. It may be, where can we go to that requires the least administrative hassle? And so if your neighboring country, and you referenced one at least in the neighborhood of Kenya, if your neighboring country allows you quicker and easier access, and you're still able to see a lot of what you would if you went to country X, the decision becomes easier. Often the conversation is had around cost. So people speak to the cost of visas, for example. Visas often cost less than air transport and even less than road transport. And yet the issue that kept coming up, and from which I think one of the key lessons that we can draw from this is an administration should also be responsive to where it has made a decision that does not work in its favor, right? Is you will find that people will still make choices simply based on the inconvenience, perceived inconvenience around the process, whether your ETA gets authorized in 2-3 minutes, or whether it takes 24 to 72 hours. You don't know until it's been approved. All you know is that it can take up to a certain amount of days. But before we open up to the wider audience, and I see in the audience colleagues from the Economic Commission for Africa, colleagues from the African Non-State Actors Platform, as well as from key development partners. So I know you have a lot of thoughts, and we want to give enough space for that exchange. I want to come back to the 3 points from earlier. I'll start with you, Prof. Linda. There were 2 specific to you, but I think Prof. Michael already started responding to one of those, right, which is around the informal let me rephrase it, not informal cross-border trade, but let me call it informal cross-border economy. A space in which not all activity across the borders relates to trade necessarily, but it stimulates the local economy there. Coming from Southern Africa, when you cross the border, for example, into Lesotho, on the one side, you'll find people selling their wares, never themselves having crossed the border, but recognizing the importance of being proximate to an economic center. The same can be said of crossing into Eswatini, into Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Botswana, where you see people gravitating towards an economic node, and recognizing that people on the move will want to eat and may need something as simple as a SIM card, for example, if they're crossing over and they don't want to be paying too much to access the cellular network in their neighboring country. So coming back to you, Linda, just on the points around informal cross-border economy, and then also having heard the other colleagues, if you could think of one other lesson that we can draw from this experience. And then I'll go to Prof. Michael and Dr. Nancy, and then open it up for discussion with everyone that's in the room with us. Prof. Linda, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ottilia. The informal cross-border economy, as you stated, is something that I felt that would be drastically affected by the ETA, because I'm thinking the people who are moving are people who are very mobile, but may not have access to digital platforms to apply for those ETAs. So for you to say you experience challenges, and also Nancy saying experiencing challenges applying, can you imagine someone who does not have a smartphone? They have what we call the mulikas, the kind of normal phones, which has no digital platform. And also just communicating to them about that ETA is also a challenge, because when we do research, people don't even know about the aspect of free movement. And they're the borders. I mean, they just know that they are able to move freely to trade across the border and come back because they know their movement is temporary, and they just know that it's something they've done for a number of years. So I think the informal cross-border economy has been affected by the ETA itself, even though you got the East African member states, they are exempted from the ETA fee. They still are expected to apply for the ETA itself. So does that mean the informality of crossing the borders has increased? Are people using more informal, porous borders to access the countries in order to continue their trade? That is something that I would want to see in terms of evidence, whether that's happening. And what are the stakeholders working in that space doing to at least address those challenges that people are facing, especially women who are engaging in cross-border trade? Have they actually now made it more difficult for women to engage in, or even just visit or just transit the country to do whatever they were doing? Because we have family members across different countries, and it's important for us to freely move to those different countries. So I think that's a question we would want to ask in terms of the ETA, in terms of whether it factored in people at the local community who have been moving more freely under the EAC free movement protocol, and now they have this other hindrance in terms of the bureaucratic process of applying. What are they doing next as a government to at least bring those people, or allow those people to move more freely without having to fill the documentation? I think from January this year, they've actually removed that requirement. And the government is currently doing an assessment on whether the ETA is actually like what are the benefits and positives and negatives of the actual ETA process. I wish that would be a public process so that people could contribute their experiences. And I think people have in their own way, through their own frustrations and their own concerns, to say that the ETA is more problematic. But I think also the government can benefit from comparing why countries like Rwanda have not gone the ETA route and they still have free movement. Like, what can they do differently? Could it be a gradual process? And I think that links to my response to the lesson learned, is that maybe the government should have gradually introduced something called an ETA, and maybe look at it from the perspective from people coming from outside the continent, because it will make more sense for someone who's coming from another part of the continent, but then also look at those countries that already have an agreement with Kenya to freely access the country, to still experience what they had before, which is freer movement or visa on arrival, then gradually add or remove certain requirements, so that at least there's less of a tedious administrative process of actually accessing the country. Because right now, I think it was a process where they introduced something to all nationalities, and that meant that it posed a lot of problems without them realizing how people have access to that platform, and whether the digital platform would respond to some of the challenges that they were experiencing. And I think they needed to do it in a gradual process. I think it would be good to see the results of the assessment of what the ETA does and what has been doing for the past year, and what they plan to do with that evidence to improve better visa-free access. But we have to just wait and see the results. I think you also asked a question on the COMESA aspect. I think it was on trade, right? If I can't remember, if you can remind me, maybe, because I think I jotted it down, but not fully.
That's okay. It was really just to say where you have, for example, prior arrangements that
Yes.
allowed for greater access, and then in implementing a new system, you
Yes.
basically take those away without the necessary amendments or engagement with the economic community?
Right. From what I know is that the government had gone back to review some of those agreements and at least remove that requirement for countries like South Africa to sort of not pay the fee, and other countries who already had that agreement for visa-free arrival. But that still meant that they still have to go through the ETA process. So I think it's something that they are gradually negotiating that process, but it's something that I think they can learn a lot more from people who regularly travel to the country and the region or choose to not migrate to the region for tourism or business purposes in order to improve how the ETA can function, or if the ETA is a viable approach for Kenya in terms of tourism and mobility to the country. So maybe I'll just leave it there and we can have a conversation thereafter.
Thank you very much. Prof. Linda has covered the questions raised quite well. So I am going to pose one question to you, Prof. Michael, based on your work, and then to Prof. Nancy, and then we open up the floor. So Prof. Michael, you are situated at Maseno University, right? Which means you've got a lot of students, in particular, to understand and research some of these issues. So I would be interested to hear from you what, in addition to what Prof. Linda just alluded to now, which is the necessary groundwork that needed to be done and that still needs to be done to make sure that the information used to guide policy is accurate, so evidence-based, so to speak. But I'm posing this to you to say, from where you sit at Maseno University, are there opportunities there in terms of contributing from the research side to inform and guide policy?
Thank you very much, Ottilia. And thank you for the question. From where I sit, and from the conversations we've had, not just in Kenya, but also regionally, there is a data vacuum, data which then could help in evidence-based policy making. And generally, as Africa as a whole, we have been very poor in weak rather in collecting data, in centralizing data. So we have data that is scattered all over, which in research. Something else that I have noted is that whereas there may be scattered data, we also do not engage much in studies that will help in coming up with policy. So we quickly tend to put together documents without really taking time. I like what Linda is saying, that she wishes there was time, there was space for people to be involved and give their experiences, for example, with the system, and give suggestions of what ought to be improved. But in the absence of that, then we end up revising the policy, revising the system, but not getting it right. So from where I sit, I see an opportunity to work with academia and be able to produce such evidence which can help not just Kenya but African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to you, Nancy, this issue around a vacuum of data. But Linda earlier spoke to how Kenya could learn from other countries, right? And I'm wondering two things. One, whether or not we shouldn't be thinking about a platform for data sharing between member states that guides and informs policy. Why should each of the 55 member states of the AU go through the same process of trying to see what is the best approach when it comes to visa-free access, when you could possibly rely also on existing information and learn from your neighbors, even those that are a little bit further afield. So that is the first around data sharing. But then the second, which is related to that, is we have the Pan-African Forum on Migration, at which all the member states should be able to come together and convene. But this is once a year. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are around a more regular information sharing platform space that doesn't have to be a convening. So that can be whether informal or otherwise, in which member states can be able to engage. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on those 2 points. One, very targeted on data sharing, and then the other really just around informal exchange outside of the formally established platforms.
Thank you, Ottilia. So on the first question, I think that this is a great idea, the platform for data sharing between member states, especially on the different phases that are being implemented. So I can mention platforms that currently exist for data sharing, even though I don't think a lot of member states are aware of it, is the AFDB AU report on visa-free policies in Africa. So that one is something that, although it doesn't necessarily go into detail about the implementation itself, it does go into detail about the scoring and what goes into the scores that are used to be able to monitor visa-free policy. And as you mentioned, PAFOM is another data sharing platform that we have. But I do want to say that another thing that we started, my team and I started, along with the head of division, is the learning missions that we have to member states that are implementing the free movement of persons protocol. So last year, as I mentioned, we had one to Rwanda, where we got to actually bring member states to be able to learn from Rwanda about the implementation of the right of entry. So I am someone who believes that, as much of a scholar and as much of an academic as I am, I'm someone who believes in practical use of data. And the only way that you can actually have people practically use the data is to involve them in the process of collection of the data itself, meaning the lessons that are there to be learned must be learned by the people who need to use it. So in that sense, I believe that one of the biggest platforms and opportunities that the African Union has is to be able to implement more study missions to implementing countries of the right of entry. So on that one, I'll leave it there. On the second one, on PAFOM, as you mentioned, it's actually not even once a year. I think it's every 2 years that we convene. And in between, the country that is convening works on the migration issues. I do think that there needs to be more regular information sharing and more regular I should say, meetings between member states on this. One of the things that the Humanitarian Affairs Division at the AU has started doing is having a report on free movement that is introduced to higher levels of member states, so executive councils and technical committees, so that they're able to know about what's going on in the continent regarding the free movement regime itself. But I do believe that there has to be a platform specifically for visa-free movement. And even just looking at the 3 flagship projects of the integration agenda of the AU, which includes FNP, includes AFCFTA, and also includes SATEM, which is a single African air transport market. So there is a gap there that we acknowledge. And I think it's a gap that the African Union is also currently working on in order to ensure that there is a platform for member states to be able to have these discussions and also to learn from each other in a more informal space. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Nancy. Colleagues, we will now open the floor for your questions, comments, and insights, please do raise your hand by going to the bottom of your screen and selecting React and Raise Hand so we can be able to note you. As you are preparing your questions and comments, I thought to turn to our senior researcher at the ISS on migration, Dr. Margaret Munyani, who led research focusing on Kenya and Ethiopia, particularly around migration governance and the rule of law. Just to hear, Margaret, your reflections on this particular topic, where in the process, and I think we've talked a bit about lessons that can be learned, and we focused very specifically on the ETA. But of course, migration governance is not just about visa access alone, but as Nancy earlier alluded to, in the broader scheme of things, we're talking beyond right of entry, also residence and establishment, but fundamentally also that migrant rights are recognized and respected throughout the migration cycle. So not only on the voluntary migration side, but perhaps also on forced displacement. So as we open up the floor for more inputs, would be interested to hear your perspective on this particular issue. Margaret, over to you.
So thank you so much, Ottilia. Yes, very interesting discussions we are having this morning, because we had it last year and we thought, why not follow up this year because of the events that have unfolded. Yes, the issue around, we know we are in the era, we are pushing for open borders, but what does open borders mean for Africa? I mean, we are, like Nancy has alluded to, that 3 stages. I mean, it gets to, we are still at the visa entry. I mean, that is the most basic. We haven't even gone to right of establishment. You see, the journey is still long, because when you say open borders, what does it only mean how easy? Because this is the discussion we're having this morning. How easy it is to get a visa to the next country. It also goes beyond the participation. What do you do once you get the visa? I hope one day we get to that discussion. Like, yes, right now we say, okay, the Kenyan government has gone back and it's reflecting on the ETA, which speaks to the question of adaptability when it comes to policy processes. But again, once people cross borders, how much space are they given to be in the host state? What can they do with the 90 days? Because is it just about going in, spending 2-3 days? I mean, so what kind of people do you want to attract? Because given the global environment with things going around, Africa needs to brace itself for trade. So we need to have discussions that are going beyond 90 days, because you can't start businesses in 90 days, that can't work. But Kenya's case is one very unique one, which speaks to why stakeholders need really to rethink. Because and I know all of us, maybe if you are interested in this debate, there was feedback from everywhere, especially online. This thing is not working. But the government was a little adamant there. I don't know why. So it also speaks to the question of how consultative are these processes? Is this just someone goes to sleep, then following morning has a dream with Angel Michael and says, this is what we want to do? I don't know, because it boils down to how consultative are these processes that lead to this. And while we want to jump within digital platforms, I know when we were in Mombasa, of course, I had a discussion with the lady from the ministry, I forget her name, and she assured the issue of data protection, but how many people even know? Are we even aware of the systems in place that are ensuring the data protection and all other issues? I think Nancy and also Linda shared an article around how much monies were. I thought people were not applying for this thing, but it looks like they got quite a big chunk out of this money, and now it has gone God knows where. But we haven't gotten the report. I don't have access to the report, but there was a tweet somewhere speaking to the effect that some monies that was collected out of this whole process in the last 1 year is missing. That is also some of the things we need to talk about. Is it now we are going in the same cycle of corruption and all that. I don't know if we are just improving avenues of collecting money for corruption or not. I don't know. Yeah, so yeah, very interesting discussion. Let me give our colleagues time to also engage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I'll turn to Ndinaye Chalumbira, who's raised her hand. Please go ahead, Ndinaye.
Thank you very much, Ottilia Ndinaye from the Economic Commission for Africa. This is a very timely discussion, and we are grateful for the invitation. I think what will come out of here will also serve as lessons for other countries who are, looking to opening their borders more. I think what we do at the Economic Commission is to link free movement of persons with the AFCFTA specifically. And while we agree that the safety and security issues are real threats, we don't know they're perceived or they're real, but it's important that we advise our member states to look at the benefits more. What is this going to do for the African Continental Free Trade Area as we are looking to fully implement the AFCFTA, especially given the events around the world. While we are doing this, we also have to accompany our member states and, assist. There have been issues raised of who are these people who are moving. So the ECA is also working on issues of legal identity. And, so we'll continue to work on these things. I mean, these are AU frameworks that were adopted at almost the same time, and it was for a reason. We cannot talk about trade without people being able to move. So I think that's what I want to indicate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that important input, Ndinaye. I think it is worth re-emphasizing the points around why it is free movement matters and why it is member states and regional economic communities are the building blocks. The Economic Commission for Africa, of course, works and engages with the African Union Commission, with regional economic communities and member states, also to be able to have constructive discussions around these issues. There are two questions also in the chat, panelists, before I turn to the one raised hand. These are from Gemachu Adugna, who is a senior migration expert who also works on the Progressive Migration Group. His questions are first, how the policy has impacted citizens from countries with existing bilateral visa-free agreements, such as Ethiopia, and what justifies the introduction of such policies where there was visa-free access. And then his second question is, how has the Kenyan public and media responded to the ETA policy? So panelists, these are two questions coming to you. Please note them. And then I hand over to Paddy Sianga Knudsen, who has her hand raised. Paddy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ottilia. And thanks to your very extinguished panel that brings us together at a time like this. I was just going to maybe piggyback right on Ndinaye's statement around a time such as this, and thinking about the fact that, Africa is now, African migrants are standing at a very monumental time waiting for its member states to open doors first. And I think for a lot of us who've been working around migration governance, we have realized that one would say we've probably overinvested in terms of talking about partners of African countries to pursue legal pathways, something that we continue to do. And speaking from the African Non-State Actors Platform, which brings together trade unions, civil society, and diaspora actors, it's been a song that we've been singing towards particularly the West and the East, with particularly the Gulf countries, in terms of how do we see better pathways for migrants that come from the African continent. And so to sing the song on the African continent, I think is something we've maybe neglected, but with the closing doors that we see, or small windows that are being opened on the doors we're expecting, I think it's really time. And so my questions go to our panelists. I really like the fact that we're talking also about evidence, and evidence that comes from migrants. And Nancy, you mentioned the fact that an opportunity that has opened up is to do the learning and sharing. And one is wondering and thinking, to what extent has, countries that you have gathered together, whether it was to visit Rwanda or other countries where indeed we're seeing progress in terms of the visa policy, so the sort of first step, what is really the stumbling block? Can we really talk about what is the stumbling block? I think Denaya tried to touch on this in terms of what we see, and what we're hearing is sort of this perceived fear of the loss of the border, of the control of borders. But then Margaret also alluded to the fact that we need people to be able to stay more than 90 days to do business, to pursue more interests. So can we also see countries maybe that want to pursue more security on who enters, but then are much more willing to have those who would enter for residence and those who would indeed go for settlement? Because for us to see the free continental the Continental Free Trade Agreement come to life in terms of increased productivity, we would need people to move and to move for more than the 90 days. So what efforts are we seeing? And this can also obviously be answered by colleagues that are working extensively in Kenya, Prof. Linda, in terms of what other things do we see in terms of this on the settlement side. And maybe my last point is a bit about collective movement and listening in. Here we are convened by ISS, and I'm thinking that, to what extent do we utilize the civil society, the think tanks on the continent, and how we can learn from how others have relied on the knowledge that is based on the continent, through the trade unions, through the civil society, through the diaspora, and how do we continue to navigate that and really bring that focus back to the importance of the Free Movement Protocol for Africans? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those important inputs and also pointed questions, if I may, Paddy. A point, perhaps just a clarification. The ISS platform is convening this event, but we do so in partnership with the African Migration and Development Policy Center that Linda serves as the executive director for, and the Kenya Institute for Migration Studies. One of our other panelists who was unfortunately unable to join us at the last minute comes from KIMS. And so for us, I think that the question you posed, this is in many ways a partial response to your question, Paddy. The question you pose around beyond convening is, of course, we do think that partnerships are important. And we think platforms in which a range of stakeholders, different perspectives come together, create greater value for the work that we do. So I wouldn't want for this event to end without re-acknowledging our partners in convening this session. I turn now to the panelists for your responses. I will do this in reverse order with your permission. So Dr. Nancy, then Michael and Linda, for your inputs and insights in response to the issues that have been raised. While the panelists are responding, colleagues that are connected with us here on Zoom, there will be a pop-up on your screen, which is an event evaluation. Please do complete that. The best way to get rid of the pop-up is to complete and hit submit. Your inputs and your insights allow us to improve our events, but also, as we are saying of the Kenyan government, allow us to draw lessons on what we can do better what we should be doing more of, and how you use the information you get from seminars that we convene. And we will definitely have more time for at least another round of questions and comments. So please do put them in the chat and raise your hand. I hand over to you, Dr. Nancy.
Thank you, Ottilia. I think the question that was mentioned by Patty, I'll address, which is what is the observed stumbling block for countries who want to or are currently implementing the right of entry phase. So one of the things that we saw in Rwanda that was a big stumbling block for them, and we also hear from a lot of countries, is the fear of, as mentioned, of losing control of the borders, but specifically the fear of security concerns. And one of the ways that Rwanda has dealt with that as a stumbling block is to have what, and I love this concept. So they have a situation room basically. And in the situation room are all of the, if you can think of all of the security agencies in that country are sitting in that room. And basically they coordinate. And it's real coordination that's happening in real time. And I think this is something that can be learned from as a lesson in terms of ensuring the security of the country, the security of the nation. I think that also one of the other ways that Rwanda is dealing with the security issues is by being innovative in the way that they're approaching security, using artificial intelligence, using I should say, the brains that they've been able to have in their countries, and having them come to the table and build solutions specific to their country, not solutions specific to Africa, but specific to their country, noting the different borders that are around them, noting the different ways in which they engage with their neighboring countries. So I think that investment in ensuring that a solution is found for their concerns, their specific concerns, is something that many countries will have to ponder upon and will have to be able to commit to. And finally, I think one major lesson that I absolutely love, and I mentioned this in Mombasa, was that Rwanda depends a lot on its diaspora. And I think this is something that a lot of member states don't necessarily think about when they're thinking about how do we ensure we not only provide for, our people, but also ensure that we are keeping our, I should say, sovereignty in the presence of, whether or not we want to implement right of entry or full implementation of the protocol itself. Being able to use and count on the diaspora is incredibly important. It is one of the biggest lessons that we learned in Rwanda, because as I mentioned, Rwanda has solutions that are specific to its country. And one of the ways that they're able to achieve those solutions without necessarily spending a lot of money is to count on their diaspora, is to engage the diaspora, is to ask the diaspora to come back and do, work for a few months so that they're able to commit to their own country. And it also strengthens the ties between the diaspora and the country itself. Another thing I wanted to point out in terms of trade in the concept, in the nexus of trade and free movement, is that we saw a lot of diaspora members who were willing to invest more in Rwanda because of the free movement of persons protocol. And you're probably wondering why. The answer to that is because they felt more confident because of the actual implementation of the protocol itself. It was no longer informal trade. Because of the implementation of the protocol, it becomes more formal because of the policies that are put in place to enable that trade. So we have actually seen a lot more investment from the Rwandan diaspora in those areas, in trade, in businesses in that country as well. So there are some economic benefits there as well. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And you raise an important point as I turn to Prof. Michael, which is that what makes trade informal is not the nature of the trade itself, it's the lack of regulation in respect of that trade. So the informality lies in the absence of frameworks that deal with that particular or those particular categories of trade. And I think that's important, that there are ways in which states can be able to formalize otherwise informal sectors. I turn to Prof. Michael. There's a number of questions here that do need response, particularly what happens where visa-free agreements existed bilaterally, and now the citizens of those countries must go through an ETA process is the key question that was posed. And then also your thoughts and insights on how the Kenyan public and media have responded to the policy. Prof. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ottilia. It's still uncertain what will happen or has happened to the bilateral agreements that previously existed, because in one way, for example, South Africa and Kenya, there was this bilateral agreement, and for South Africans now they don't have to pay for the ETA, as far as I remember. We have agreements with Ethiopia and so on and so forth. So this is still yet to unfold, but at least there are some of those considerations that have so far been made, and we will see as time goes. But one thing I also want to point out in terms of the response, the responses, we have had some media coverage, but not much, and particularly because of the mixed reactions from the public and so on. The media as an agenda setter also, I think, is in a position where they don't quite understand what is exactly happening. Because in one instance, we are talking about free movement, we are talking about free visa, but at the same time, there is some fee being paid by, members, individuals from certain member states. So the question of how free it is, or whether it is free, still remains, and Kenya is yet to clarify that. The other thing that I have seen in all this is the question of communication, because at some point there was information circulated that Kenya had now done away with, with the ETA and so on and so forth. Yet it turned out to be the opposite. So there has been also there is therefore an element of communication and how all this is communicated. So I think one lesson we learn from that as the rest of Africa is, yes, policies may be good, policies may be well intended, but how do you communicate those policies across the region so that people get to understand what all these policies are all about? They may be well intended, but communication is key here. The other last thing I want to mention has got to do with questions around reciprocity. I mean, as Kenya continues to levy fees through the ETA on individuals from certain other member states, what is the expected reciprocation from other member states? And with that, what implications does that have on the dream that Africa has, the CFTA, the free movement of persons protocol, and all those? What are the implications on those, big dreams that the continent has? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Can't stress enough the importance of clear communication, not only from the media, who draws its information from a wide range of stakeholders, but from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So clear communication, verbal, but also in written platforms. Earlier, Margaret made the point that not everyone will have access to some of these digital tools, a point that, that Linda also referenced. So what are the ways, not only that you communicate clearly, but what are the platforms on which you communicate this information so that someone in Maseno and someone in Nairobi, in Mombasa, in Kisumu receives the same information, but importantly, because these are not the people that will need the ETA, someone in Addis Ababa, in Lomé, in Pretoria also receives the same information and can be able to use it in the process of their migration journey. I turn finally now to Prof. Linda on your reflections on the issues that have been raised, including particularly where policies lead to reversal, and what are people saying on the ground in Kenya, if you know, about the ETA? Has it impacted their lives the way that it has impacted those seeking to access Kenya?
Thanks, Ottilia. I feel like they've kind of answered most of the questions, so I'll try and add a bit more. I think in terms of those on the ground being impacted, I think there are those who are reliant on maybe tourists coming into the country. And if they're not able to access the country, then they're obviously going to cancel and go to another country, which is what I think most people have done. They've gone to Tanzania, they've gone to Uganda because of ease of access. And I recall, I think around the time or earlier before the ETA was introduced, there was an East African tourism visa that allowed people who are traveling to Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda to access one visa to access all three visas. So it raised questions as, okay, if I need an ETA to access Kenya, but I just need a different process to go to Uganda or to Rwanda, then I'll choose the easiest country to access a visa to access all three. So what does that mean for regional dynamics when it comes to tourism? Because I know EAC is focused on how do we leverage on tourism as an economic bloc, and now we're a much larger economic bloc to include Somalia and DRC. We have to have that conversation at a regional level of how that should work, because that will have a direct impact on all services, not just hospitality. It has an aspect on transport, on food industry, looking at the knock-on effect on that. And that's why I would want the research to be very comprehensive. If the government is doing an assessment on the ETA, they must look at everything from on the value chain for trade, on the value chain for tourism, on the value chain for anything that requires someone to come and do to visit the country, which will allow them to get a comprehensive assessment of whether the ETA is working for some and not for others. And that will make them make the right decisions in terms of either revising the ETA approach to have some aspects of it operational because it has actually been beneficial, but also maybe dropping some aspects of the ETA. But that will now be informed by evidence. And I think I like the idea that happens in Rwanda. Having done a lot of research in Rwanda, I have seen that they have comprehensively used evidence to inform their policy response. And they just basically ensure that they've looked at ticked all the right boxes to indicate that this policy now is based on what we've been able to see on the ground, including how migrants can easily move or can manage the system there. So I think that is one thing that I would want to say. But also, I think I would try and answer Gilmacher's question about the bilateral visa-free agreement. What I have seen is that those countries like Ethiopia that have had a long-standing agreement with Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, and other countries that are outside the EAC region, those agreements, they are not required to obviously pay for the fee. I think I mentioned this earlier, but they still have to apply for the ETA. And the one thing I would want to see is that what does that mean for those who are applying for the ETA? Is it more cumbersome and they've chosen not to apply for it anymore because it's still a tedious administrative bureaucratic process? And that is those are some of the questions that I wish the government will do in terms of assessing the ETA from that angle, and having maybe even a public dialogue with people about this ETA, and just having those difficult conversations which most people in general, not necessarily government, do not want to have about whether the ETA is good or bad, and how can we improve it if there's some good aspects that actually work for the country. But I think on a continental level, it could pose a challenge for free movement. It could pose a challenge for regional integration, because now everyone is in different camps, using different approaches to control or to manage the type of flows that come into the country. So maybe I'll leave it there, because I've seen there's a question that has been posed, or it's a comment from Paddy online.
Thank you very much, Linda. Paddy makes the comment that while the ETA system has its gaps, the processing for her as a Zambian passport holder in which a bilateral agreement exists was free and under 20 minutes. But the panic was less for the travel arrangements. And for her, she's wondering whether we can challenge ourselves as non-state actors working in collaboration with the Economic Community, Economic Commission for Africa and the AU Commission to target collective advocacy to countries that host key African Union institutions. So the challenging experience that African passport holders face when entering these countries for meetings, which are intergovernmental, are really a drawback on effective engagement in delivering the results for Agenda 2063. So this is really a plea or a call from Paddy to say, if we are thinking, if we listen to what Dr. Nancy Adossi said earlier, which is that the number of ratifications for the free movement protocol are lagging far behind those for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And yet there are a number of countries that have not ratified that host AU or regional economic communities, headquarters or their offices within their countries, that make it extremely difficult also for those wishing to attend engagements with those institutions. So could those be the first countries that are pushed towards ratification? And these are many countries. These are countries hosting different institutions, from the AU Development Agency, NEPAD, to the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, to institutions responsible for migration research or counterterrorism research, to those hosting the headquarters for our many regional economic communities, from where I sit in the Southern African Development Community, all the way north to the Arab Maghreb Union. Should these be the countries that first push for the ratification, and then we see a rollout within their sub-regions and within the communities in which they host? We have one final comment and question from Samuel Kojo Wemona. Please go ahead and pose your question or make your comment.
Okay, I think I had challenge with the audio, but it's back now. So I just want to make a brief contribution, which is the fact that issues like the ETA are not necessarily best when we want to look at free movement within Africa to do business and grow together as a people. It only increases travel barriers that are not too good enough. There may be genuine concerns or justifications for imposing such restrictions, as Kenya took into consideration issues with security concerns and all that. But I think such issues will not help the after process, which we are all willing to set aside those barriers to ensure economic and other growth within Africa. And there could also be challenges with economic and social disruptions, where people may travel for school, medical care, and other family experience, tourism, and all that. In one way or the other, all these things will be affected. no matter the measures put in place, free movement will always be best if we can put in measures to control the excesses of such policies. So that's my brief contributions to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input. From your name, Samuel, I will assume that you are a child born on a Monday, and we welcome your
Exactly.
input all the way from Ghana. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. I'll turn now to Opemo.
Thank you very much, Ottilia. It might be very unfair to speak about ETA as is the topic of the day without having to talk to a Kenyan, and specifically a Kenyan who understands and works with the same system. Thank you, Professor Linda, who took us through a specific topic. I'd like to also mention that I'm from the Kenya Institute of Migration Services, but I'm not allowed to talk in my capacity as a government official. So you'll forgive me. I will talk a bit scholarly. The sentiments therein about African Continental Free Movement Protocol have been expressed very loudly, and I want to respond first of all to my fellow participant who was asking about how the implementation of some countries is better than the others. Let me tell you, first of all, as Kenya, we are so proud because we always take up these implementations firsthand. We want to also appreciate the efforts of Ghana to completely do that free visa regime. Now, it speaks a lot on the sovereignty of a country and managing its borders in its sovereign capacity. And in terms of security, what I'm alluding to is very simple. There is the aspect of in migration, mobility, and movement, externalizations of borders, which are encouraged by most European countries. So that means it stops being just a border, say, for example, in Kenya, and how we allow movement of people and commodities and goods, and it becomes a whole security issue, which Kenya is facing, and historically so, from all the attacks that we've experienced from our brother up north. And we have really worked towards encouraging the East African community, and we have ratified several agreements within the AU Free Movement Protocol. As we speak, Kenya is. I wonder why. I wonder why the issues for refugees and asylum seekers was not touched, because that is also a mobility and migration aspect, which my country brother in Uganda receives the highest number according to UN-DESA statistics. So we do see that the reason why our neighborhoods move from their country to our country with an eye of either repatriation, resettlement, or voluntary return. So while we are looking at free movement, we also should look at the figure of the migrant when they are migrating. Most people who are talking here maybe have moved from south and went to the Europes and the United States, and they might not be feeling as much pressure as it is with the African continents and the African governments being left to now control those other people who are returning from those other particular nations. I would like to state that in the East Africa, in the Electronic Travel Authorisation issue, we have the aspect of technology and technology adoption. It is not very key in African countries, and I'm pretty sure there are other measures and methods that we can all adopt based on the experiences of other African countries to be able to influence and propel this particular growth. I am willing, participating, and visionary enough to be able to be invited and to continue having this scholarly discussion towards allowability of people to be within a country, how to improve the economy, and how to be better. I mean, as a matter of fact, while the ETA is not working, Kenya is a hub of Amazon Web Services. It is the headquarters of Microsoft East Africa, and proudly so, the United Nations. So yes, we are the best, and thank you for the inputs.
Thank you very much, Opemo, for that input, which you do give us in your personal capacity. I do think the points that you raise are extremely important in how we have a holistic conversation. Of course, the seminar was focused specifically on the issues arising from the electronic visa policy itself. And we have, as the Institute for Security Studies, regularly convening different discussions that touch on a range of issues that you cover, whether it's security, whether it's forced displacement, whether it is how countries respond comprehensively to the refugee issues and challenges, or violent extremism and terrorism. This is very much the business of the Institute. We wouldn't be able to cover every single issue within an hour and a half, but we greatly appreciate your input and the ways in which we can be able later down the line also to convene discussions that focus on some of the specific issues you raise. Colleagues, over the past hour and 25 minutes, we've been discussing the lessons from Kenya's fraught electronic visa policy. Why did we choose to have a discussion on Kenya? Perhaps for the very reasons that Opemo raises. Kenya is a hub within East Africa. It is also a country that is steering forward towards its development. It does this in many different ways, whether it's through its great tourism sector, its ability to attract international and other investment, but also its convenient geographic location. That's not to say the other 54 African countries don't matter. In fact, in the efforts towards free movement across the African continent, conversations like this should touch on all 55 member states of the African Union, having honest and critical reflections about what are the challenges to ratification, what are the issues, listening to those issues that they raise, and also drawing lessons. So while other countries can learn from Kenya's process, likewise, Kenya too can learn from how other countries have been able to adjust, adapt, and develop policies and practices that work for them. From my side, as the head of special projects for the Institute for Security Studies out of Pretoria, it's been an honor to convene this discussion and to have the insights of those of you that provided questions and comments to stimulate discussion, but in particular for Professor Linda Oucho, the Executive Director of the African Migration and Development Policy Center from Kenya and based in Kenya, to the Dr. Michael Owisa, the director, the Odera Akango campus, and the dean in the School of Development and Strategic Studies at Maseno University in Kenya, and Dr. Nancy Adossi, an independent migration expert with experience that spans Africa as well as other regions in the world, and having worked at the AU Commission in particular around the implementation of the Free Movement Protocol and the efforts towards full ratification. We have had amazing and expert insights also from colleagues on the African Non-State Actors Platform, from the Economic Commission for Africa, as well as from colleagues from the Kenya Institute of Migration Studies, with whom we have also collaborated in convening this session. What's left for me is to thank you for your time and your attention, but importantly also to thank you all for your commitment towards dealing with issues of migration governance and the rule of law beyond an hour and a half. I know that everyone that has been part of this seminar is someone who works on migration issues or is interested in being part of the discussion. So please do continue to steer conversations around this issue in a constructive way. To repeat the words of Ndinaye, leverage the benefits, manage the risks. So let's focus on what we can be able to do to have a constructive conversation, but let that constructive conversation be rooted in honesty and honest reflection on some of the hurdles and challenges that come from that. Thank you, colleagues. This was Lessons from Kenya's Fraught Electronic Visa Policy seminar co-hosted by the Institute for Security Studies, African Migration and Development Policy Center, and the Kenya Institute of Migration Studies. We are thankful for your time, your energies, and we hope you have a great day further. Asante sana.